Coming to you from the heart of the Diocese of Savannah, this is It's Catholic, Y'all, a series of conversations about faith and life. Views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent the views of the Diocese of Savannah.
Hey everybody, I'm Patrick Tennell, and I am the Director of Fellowship in Life for the Diocese of Savannah. This is It's Catholic, Y'all, the Diocesan podcast. I'm joined here with Father Thomas Joseph White. Father Thomas Joseph White is the rector of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, also known as the Angelicum. He's a main member of the band the Hillbilly Thomists. He's a Thomistic scholar and author, and also a Dominican priest. And unless I missed anything there, Father, we can just jump into some questions. The first thing I wanted to ask you is, I know that you grew up in Statesboro, Georgia, so you grew up in our diocese, and from what I understand, you weren't Catholic. I think a lot of the people a lot of our listeners would love to hear about your upbringing, what it was like growing up in South Georgia.
Well, thank you. First, it's a great honor, and I'm very happy to be here to talk to you. Yeah, I grew up in Statesboro, Georgia, formative years of my childhood and high school education from around 1975 to around 1987. And I went then off to 2 years of boarding school. And during that time, I had really almost no engagement with the Catholic Church, although there is St. Matthew's Parish, of course, in the town. Subsequently, I got involved in that parish when I would visit my parents after I had become Catholic. But I really discovered Catholicism, I could say, in a way, while I was there on college break, because a friend of mine gave me letters of Flannery O'Connor when I was, I think for my birthday, when I turned 18 or 19. And I sat during a, Thanksgiving break, or I think it was a Christmas break, and I read a lot of her letters, and that was kind of my first intellectual moment where I started to think seriously about Catholicism. I had a little bit of architectural experience of the Catholic Church, because the summer before I became an undergraduate, I took a train trip around Europe with friends, and I went to Mont Saint Michel, among other places, and saw what it looks like to see the beautiful medieval architecture, and went into St. Peter's, and so I had some experiences of Christian art and beauty. And I think that, coupled with Flannery O'Connor's letters, began it was like an invitation to me to explore Catholicism more.
Wow, that's awesome. I knew we were going to talk about Flannery O'Connor some today, but I did not realize she was like kind of right there at the beginning of your introduction to Catholicism. Where did the priesthood start to fit in with that conversion? Was it pretty quick, or did it start to come through other resources?
When I was 16, I went to boarding school for 2 years in Massachusetts. Then I went to Brown University, which is a very secular university, but I began to have religious questions and read kind of widely in a variety of different religions. I took classes on, kind of serious classes on Buddhism and Hinduism, and then eventually on Christianity, and got intrigued by, you might say, comparative religion. But then I discovered, at the same time, Flannery O'Connor's letters, and started reading more Catholic thought. And I initially was baptized by the college minister, the campus minister, who was Episcopalian, but then started reading my way into Catholicism. That's the way I put it. I read my way into Catholicism. And since that, I read I started reading modern theologians and also taking classes on church fathers, and started going to Mass and sitting in the back, not taking communion. Anyway, but if you fast forward 3 years, by the time I was a senior in college, I went to a Benedictine monastery to kind of think more seriously about whether to become a Catholic. That's all I was thinking about. But while I was experiencing Eucharistic adoration and the religious life, I suddenly had this, I would say, strong sense, and also, really kind of holy fear, that I was called to be a religious, member of a religious order and a priest. And remembered that was very surprising to me. So I think it came out of the blue a little bit, when I was 22. But then I, of course, that experienced that for a sustained way for a couple of years, both the year I was becoming Catholic and the year after I became Catholic. And so, a few years after I was Catholic, I entered religious life.
Now, I know this, I just happen to know this, but the Dominicans are present at Brown University now. I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
Were they present at the time, and were you engaged with them at all,
No,
or is that a later?
no, not at all. No, so actually, I didn't know anything about the Dominicans, and that's an interesting part of the story. I mean, just in the sense that Brown had a very, I would say, limited chaplaincy. There were a couple of good older priests who were there, but they were very quiet, very careful, you might say, in that very political, non-Catholic context. And then after them, there was a priest who worked very hard to establish a more sustained uh, presence, and he's still alive in this world and did a great job. And then after that, when he was retiring, the diocese thought they didn't have enough people to put a full-time chaplain in. So he called me actually and said, do you think one of the Dominicans could take the chaplaincy? And I talked with our provincial, and then that moved forward. And we took the chaplaincy only some years ago. I want to say, I mean, it's like roughly about 2011, 2012. And then we built it up and actually renovated a house there, created a very intense program, received people into the Catholic Church, had vocations. So, quite a lot's happened in the Brown chaplaincy because of I wouldn't take credit for it. It's because the Dominican chaplains who've gone there have been very dynamic, very creative, and zealous. So I got into Oxford to do patristic studies after 4 years at Brown, and I went over to Oxford, and I was a new Catholic, got very involved in the chaplaincy, actually lived next door to the chaplaincy, as it turned out, just because my college in Oxford was next door. And there was an assistant chaplain at the time who was Dominican. And I mean, I think I met him like the first week or second week, and I said, what are Dominicans? And he told me about St. Dominic, and that was the first time I'd ever heard of the Dominicans. But I got to be good friends with the Dominicans in Oxford. And it was through my friendship with Dominicans in Oxford between 1993 and 1995, I really learned about St. Thomas Aquinas. I understood there was this whole beautiful intellectual life of study allied with common prayer, fraternal life, and then preaching, evangelization, and kind of taking all intellectual problems seriously and not being too ready to be ideological, but being kind of careful and trying to make distinctions and study things carefully. And I got into the Dominican ethos as a layperson during my time in England.
Wow. That's now I've always kind of wondered this, and I guess the answer might be in the story you just told. But I was a seminarian for our diocese for a while. I studied at the Angelicum, but I've always wondered, did you for any time discern the diocese as a diocesan priest, or was it just kind of this time with the Dominicans?
So, I've worked with a lot of people as a priest, over the years in discerning religious life versus discerning the diocesan priesthood. And there's not always a straightforward clarity about that in people's lives. They need to spend time and get exposed to diocesan life, of course, in a way, but also especially religious life to figure this out. But in most cases, people have a pretty clear sense of where they're called. I mean, not always, but most of the time. The big exception is when they've entered the diocesan seminary, but they've never experienced religious life, and then maybe they experience it subsequently. Okay, that exists. But in my case, it was just really clear to me from the beginning I had a vocation to the religious life and the priesthood in the religious life. So it's not that I don't have a love for the diocesan priesthood, and I teach diocesan seminarians and priests in Rome, and I could be comfortable, I think, being a diocesan priest, at that form of life. But from the beginning, I really felt this strong inner impulse to religious life. It was really unambiguous.
I can relate. As I said, when I was discerning priesthood, I had no experience of the religious orders until getting to like the Angelicum and encountering the Dominicans for the first time, at least in person. So, but I would imagine most people go in that order. Very few people would just encounter religious orders and not diocesan priesthood.
That's true, but it can happen. I mean, it happened more when people grew up in like a Dominican parish or went to a Jesuit university or maybe went to a Benedictine university, and they kind of thought that was the way to be a priest. And later they realized, it's too much corporate collectivity for them. They have a more independent vocation. They become a diocesan priest. It happens, but it's rarer.
Now, Father, not to change the topic too quickly, but you become a Dominican priest and then you also join a band. I imagine, is it typical for Dominicans to start bluegrass bands, or is that
yeah, it's required actually. I mean, any Dominican who doesn't start a bluegrass band usually gets no. Yeah, so that's obviously eccentric. You're being very gentle, but you're intimating that it's eccentric. So what I'd say about that was, when I entered the Dominican order, we had a novice master who kind of he knew we were all kind of sufficiently intellectual, kind of interested in liturgy, interested in prayer, interested in studies, zealous about the church, but he was concerned about us being, well-rounded human beings. So we had to have a hobby. I don't know if this works as a method. We had to have a hobby on Thursdays to kind of, become more well-rounded. And I said, well, because he suggested you could take up an instrument, like learn to play classical music on the organ or whatever. And we were in Cincinnati, so that's very near. It's just across the river from Kentucky. There's a big bluegrass scene. And I asked, well, could I learn to play bluegrass mandolin? And they bought me a very inexpensive, $150 Chinese-made instrument and paid for lessons. And I got really into it. And, it was just one day a week, but I was sort of. Now, some years later, there had been other men who'd entered from Kentucky who were musical. We started play little concerts for fun, around just like maybe twice a semester. You do a Saturday evening, and then we played sometimes after a party or after a ordination. But then a bunch of younger guys entered who were in our province in Washington, D.C., where our formation is, who were very gifted musicians, like professionals. Some of them had recorded in Nashville or Asheville. And they kind of joined this band, which we named after the Hillbilly Thomists, after Flannery O'Connor. Flannery O'Connor has a letter where she says, people see my stories as the expression of a hillbilly nihilist, or people think I'm a hillbilly nihilist, but I'm actually a hillbilly Thomist. And she did read the Summa Theologiae some and read books about Aquinas. She was a big devotee of Maritain and Gilson. And, so we played bluegrass music and old-time folk music, and we're Thomists, disciples of Thomas Aquinas. So obviously we're hillbilly Thomists, and it makes a lot of sense. Also Catholics with art, and it's fun to reappropriate some of the old time and bluegrass songs, especially the most religious ones or the kind of weird religious murder ballads, and sing them as Catholic seminarians and priests. And the irony wasn't lost on us or anybody else who listened to it. But then the seminary made CDs back when people made CDs. We made albums with CDs to make money, sell them in the parishes of the Dominicans around the East Coast on Christmas, and make some money for formation, pay for formation. You make tens of thousands of dollars to keep the lights on. So there had been a number of sacred music albums made in the Studium, the House of Studies in Washington, D.C., and people felt that was a little bit tired because we made 5 or 4 or so many of those, Christmas album, all that. So somebody said, well, why don't we have the Hillbilly Thomists make a folk album? So we got permission. In 2017, we made this folk album, and it went on the Billboard charts to our great surprise, and has remained a popular album. So then we made another album in 2020, another in 2021, another in 2023. Yeah, we've done a couple of tours. We've been on the 4 of our 4 albums, 3 have been on the Billboard charts, and we've become a kind of like an underground hipster band for Catholic homeschool families. And there's some hundreds of thousands of fans. There's a lot of fans in Europe. There's a lot of fans even in you'd find people who listen to Hillbilly Thomists even in Asia, Catholics. Yeah. So Spotify, you can find it on Spotify. Obviously, you don't have to pay for it there. YouTube's got everything, but you can also find the Hillbilly Thomists, if you want to download the albums and own them. Of course, that's nice for formation. It helps us pay for priestly vocations. Everything goes to pay for priestly vocations. It's a nonprofit, obviously. And, you can find, there's a good website. You can find the music also on Amazon and Apple. And so it's a kind of professional thing. There's the merch. There's, you can get a hat. You can get shirts. There's some Flannery O'Connor themed stuff with peacocks, because she had peacocks. Everything that rises must converge, all that stuff. So, there's a kind of a Flannery O'Connor afterlife of symbolism and we do use a lot of references both to her literature and to Thomas Aquinas, especially in the songs, though not exclusively them. Of course, there's a lot of other weird references going on. So kind of weird hobby. It's evolved as a sideline pastoral work, very popular with under 6 human beings. Lots of homeschool families listen to it. All these little kids become mega super fans and learn all the words.
So I am a homeschooling dad, I also like help with the youth ministry at my church. That it's a very interesting youth group in the sense that 90% of it is homeschooling families. So I'm aware of this scene, and it's interesting. You're 100% correct. And I've noticed that at my youth group, their favorite song is Bluegrass, Bourbon, and the Bible, which I don't know what that says about the youth group, if that's their, I don't know if that's usually the kids' favorite song, but I'm kind of curious. I feel like when I was at the Tybee Island show that y'all played, you mentioned a kind of like an origin story behind that song that I didn't fully catch. What was the? Can you talk about that song? Because were you one of the main writers for that song?
I wrote Bourbon, Bluegrass, and the Bible in 2020, and I wrote it in like April. If you remember what was happening then, that's when COVID had just begun. And in Italy, where I was, in this building here in Rome, the Angelicum, maybe Americans don't realize the Italians, for the first time since 1945, the Second World War, put the entire country under martial law in order to try to contain the spread of COVID. Now, they had no idea really what they're dealing with, because it was the first, after China, Italy was the first real recipient of a major wave of it, and the first country with a free press. So it was really unclear what it was, and it seems very virulent, and a lot of young Italian nurses and doctors were dying, so there was a lot of concern. Anyway, all that's context. We were put on lockdown, but like literally you couldn't leave your house except the grocery store or the pharmacy, and that with rare permissions, blah blah blah. So I was in the house a lot. Now this is a large building with a beautiful library, beautiful garden. I was writing a book, but I kind of was reflecting on surviving life in hard times, and so it's kind of like the lyrics go, "Death's in the world, and it's gone viral. Everybody's talking about a new revival, but when it's a question of love and survival, bourbon, bluegrass, and the Bible." And then the rest of it's a kind of scattershot set of poetic images of what you might call a redneck kaleidoscope. A sort of bunch of images, mostly probably southern, southeast Georgian, rural trailer park symbolism about like surviving in hard times, but with a little bit of humor and a little bit of melancholy.
So it's the perfect song for someone from our diocese to get if it's filled with kind of symbolism of our place.
It's a pretty Catholic song, but it's a Catholic song that has a kind of from concentric circles, moves from Statesboro outward.
Something that's interesting, I was thinking about this when y'all came to Tybee Island semi-recently to this recording. It was last year.
Yeah. August. The perfect time to play outside in Tybee Island. August.
Yeah. No, it was it was an amazing show, but it just kind of stirred this thought in me too of like, what's it like being a priest on tour? I don't know if how far y'all's tour went, but that's not something typical a priest does. Once again, it's eccentric, right? Like to go on tour as a priest.
Well, I can say something about that. So first of all, it is a little incongruous or strange, but we only do it. We have 2 weeks out of the year we can really afford the time to do this, and we do an album one year and a tour the other year. So it's like 2 weeks every 2 years. So it's not like huge amount. But what I would say, what we've discovered is, here's what happens. The songs some of them are more humorous and some are more sort of serious. Some of them are like serious, poetic, and beautiful, and some are like humorous and energetic. I write the humorous, energetic, crazy Uncle in the Attic songs, and Justin Bolger writes this sort of serene, beautiful, melancholic, deep songs. And then there's some other people in the band writing songs, So you put the songs out there and you do it for fun, really. It's a kind of meditation. It's a kind of celebration of life. It's a kind of artistic act of creativity. Okay. But what happens is the music has its own importance to people, and it helps them in distinct ways. So they may find a song or some songs that they really, you might say, own or receive, and they helps them live through things, or they celebrate life with it lightly, joyfully, or in a grave way. So what happens when you tour is some people are discovering the music and surprised, like, why are these priests playing this music? What weird, but it's pretty good music. Other people, though, are really kind of fans of the band, and some of them have really lived with the songs, and I would say they're as much their songs as ours. And then they share the stories with us about what those songs mean to them. We were talking to one person on tour this last summer who said, I listened to your albums the whole year my daughter was dying of cancer, and I listened to your albums the whole year after my daughter died of cancer, and they helped me pull through. And the person started crying. And it was one of the most moving things I think I've ever heard, And you don't write the songs with a pretense that that's going to mean something to someone that way. Of course, you mean what you sing. But what happens is music has a kind of universality that's very peculiar. It's intellectual, it's also felt, it's emotional, it's in your body, it's in your imagination, and people receive it and it's theirs, So they share those stories with us, and we're like their brothers or their family members, in the sense that their music also means a lot to us. And it's a kind of community. I mean, it's not the same as the communion of the Catholic Church, but in the communion of the Catholic Church, it's often with these people we have a feeling of kind of like a gentle solidarity, a friendship, shared life of prayer. And of course, we meet people on the tour too who think, who are these guys dressed so strange? And it's fun to also break down expectations, not in a shocking way, but just in a gentle way, to be priests with people, to be friendly. Because you stay in hotels, you got to stay in hotels sometimes. You're in Knoxville, you're in a hotel, walking down Main Street, going to the Bijou Theater to play. The hippie guys who are setting up the set, are the hipster dudes with the beards. They're like probably never hung out with a Catholic priest behind stage. But, so you get to talk about your favorite Johnny Cash song with them.
Yeah. Does it seem to, I mean, this is a little bit of an off the cuff question here. Like, does it seem to give a kind of wholeness? Thomists and maybe Dominicans in this group sometimes are kind of known for a specifically intellectual, approach. Having a band, and with some of the stories you just shared, there's kind of like the fullness of, kind of human experience kind of wrapped up in a Dominican package. Does that ever like surprise people? Or do most people not think about Dominicans that much to be?
I'm sure people, well, I mean, I'm sure some people think it's some kind of gimmick to try to prove we're relevant. If you think we're kind of like, it's a throwback to the 70s, or prove that we're maybe, Thomists, and so traditional theologically, but still relatable. We don't ever think about it. We don't care about all that. We just like the music and we just do it for fun. And I think a kind of grave fun, or like a deep fun, a profundity in the fun, in the sense that we really do sing about Christ, or we sing about life as a Catholic. We don't really try to, I mean, we do, there is a kind of preaching going on, but it's very natural. It's very spontaneous and deep. It's not, I think, saccharine and artificial, or even, you might say, slanted. It's just what happens when you're a really kind of religious person. You write about life. What I'd say is it probably does give people a more full understanding of what it could be to be a Catholic. Certainly, this, I think, non-Catholics see all these Catholics having fun, celebrating, singing these funny songs, or these beautiful songs. I think that's a big eye-opener. Like, Catholic culture has this kind of, fifth wall, or whatever it is. It's like other dimension that's kind of really deep and cool. And I think that really helps people to see the humanity of the church, the beauty of like celebrating ordinary life. Folk music, when it's done well, like Irish folk music or bluegrass music, it's the celebration of ordinary life. It's, I would say, the sacred music of ordinary time. It's not the music you play in church. I don't think so. Not me personally. It's not my preference. I'm more classical, but it's music that accompanies ordinary existence and makes it kind of sacred in its own way, while you're riding in the car, or taking a walk, or cooking something in the kitchen, or whatever. And I think we're part of that.
I can actually attest to a huge part of that, because when y'all were in Tybee, I mean, so I've been living in Savannah for about a year and a half now. I've been up in Macon for a while before that, but it was like every Catholic I've known since moving to Savannah was at y'all's show. But then I noticed, because I was helping with y'all's merch stand, I noticed an incredible amount of people who just happened to be at the beach, investing, kind of showing curiosity of what was going on, and also buying y'all's merch. I mean, I was amazed by the amount of people who were interested, who weren't Catholic, but then, kind of dove in all the way. They bought y'all's albums. They did everything just based on going to the beach that day. So I think they were overwhelmed by a Catholic presence on Tybee Island, and then also introduced into everything you just shared.
Well, that's definitely one of the most strange venues we've ever played. It's not every day you go to the beach in August and play as a Dominican monk in your habit, a bunch of bluegrass music. So that was definitely a weird one. But, like as you say, it worked out. There was that Methodist youth group that were there also to evangelize at the beach, and they ended up learning a lot about Catholicism. That was funny.
And y'all played venues like that, but you also played at the National Eucharistic Congress as well, right? So y'all played in kind of the Catholic of Catholic.
We played the Grand Ole Opry. We played the Grand Ole Opry. We played the Bijou Theater in Knoxville. So we played some of the great music halls too. It's not every day. We played a lot of high school gyms. We played a great high school gym in Atlanta. We played a great high school gym in Charlotte. We played a great high school gym before in Cincinnati. We played in parish halls in Pittsburgh. So, we play in some, I might say, ordinary life settings, but some of those places can hold 400 or 500 people, and they're really great venues. So we kind of mix it up. We played in Washington, D.C. We played Franciscan Hall that you can rent. That we played the National Rosary Pilgrimage in D.C. that had thousands of people for that. So, we played Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame. We're going to play at Baylor with the Baptists in September, if all holds well, as planned. Go down to Waco, going to Waco.
So with Hillbilly Thomists, and you said that name comes from Flannery O'Connor, her letters. I imagine most of the listeners are familiar with the term hillbilly, but not everybody is familiar with Thomist. You mentioned earlier that it's a disciple of St. Thomas. Is that kind of like what is the essence of being a Thomist? Is it a disciple of St. Thomas?
Well, there's an internal argument about that, but let's just start at the beginning. The Dominican order began 800 years ago with St. Dominic in Spain, and then a generation later, Thomas Aquinas enters from Rocaseca in south of Rome from a noble family. He didn't know St. Dominic. Dominic had already died, but he's right after him. And Thomas Aquinas is the most brilliant, philosopher and theologian of the 13th century, though there were other greats. Goes to teach in Paris, helps receive Aristotle, the newly translated Latin versions of Aristotle, how to interpret them in the medieval West. So Aquinas becomes the greatest mind of the 13th century through his 8 million words of writing, 20,000 printed pages, large volumes of, many volumes and large volumes of great works. The Summa Theologiae is the most famous. And what happens then after that is the order decides pretty quickly, the Dominican order decides pretty quickly to make his teaching a kind of general formation instrument. In other words, basically, young Dominicans are taught to read Aquinas, interpret him and his major works. Actually, it's his sentences commentary for the first few hundred years, and then in the 16th century with Cardinal Cajetan, who debated with Luther, who was a Dominican and the general of the order, they move much more toward the Summa Theologiae, and to this day, it's retained a kind of influence. But as people read Aquinas, they, of course, continue to think about how his teachings about what human nature is, or how we know God, or so-called metaphysics, what is being, or goodness, or unity, or truth, or beauty, nature of human freedom, what human actions are, what the human soul is, how to understand and catalog actions that are good and evil, virtues versus vices, how to explain fundamental biblical mysteries like the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Atonement, the Resurrection, the Sacraments, Mariology, the mystery of the Church. He's got writings on all these things, and also on like physical nature and the relationship between the essences or natures of biological and non-living physical realities as they relate to component parts and mathematical sciences. So his mind's very, very wide-ranging. And what happens is as people begin to not only study it, renew the study of it, but also engage with contemporary philosophers and theologians in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, you have people who are both teaching Aquinas' principles or ideas about reality, and now, in dialogue, further developing them or defending them in conversation with other contemporary thinkers. And that creates this whole, you might say, lineage of thinking with Aquinas we call Thomism, or and you could say it's kind of a deep archaeology of many layers. So people were writing about what should the Catholics think about Descartes, or what should they think about Galileo, or should they think about Darwin? How should we engage with Marx? And you've got Thomists writing about these figures, including now to our day, Nietzsche or analytic philosophy, all the way to the modernity, contemporary world, using Aquinas as a resource for thinking about the Catholic Church's relationship to the modern sciences, or the Catholic Church's relationship to constitutional democracy, bioethical questions about whether you could take a person off a ventilator and under what conditions, or all kinds of problems, the ethics of nuclear deterrence, things that Aquinas would not have conceived of, but actually his thought is so deep, so expansive, and so powerful. He gives you a lot of principles from which to derive further thinking. So in Thomism, you study historically Aquinas to understand him accurately and get him right, but you also look at how to employ his principles in the living world of the human mind and culture in the service of the church and the university. And I work at the Angelicum, which is a university named after Aquinas. It's one of the pontifical universities in Rome, 7 pontifical universities. It's the one run by the Dominicans. And this lineage of thinking with Aquinas is very much a part of our DNA. So it's a Thomistic university.
I've noticed in a lot of Catholics, who start getting interested in kind of the intellectual aspects of the faith, are eager to read St. Thomas. They buy a nice copy of the Summa, and then they get quickly overwhelmed by, it's seems like a jigsaw puzzle to them as they try to read it.
Well, this is a real problem. Like when I first started to read Aquinas as a layperson, I had no idea what he was talking about. All these terminologies: potency and act, substance, essay, and existence. I mean, the technical vocabulary does take some time to get to know, but the great thing is once you really understand the technical vocabulary and the philosophy it signifies, it's actually pretty easy, not just to understand Aquinas, but to learn from him continually and even anticipate some of the things he's going to say. I mean, I've been learning from Aquinas for now 25 plus years, and I still am always getting insight from him. So I think he's very, very knowledgeable and profound. And I read a lot of other authors, by the way. So when I say that, I say it comparatively. I mean, I've been reading other people for decades as well. I get a lot out of their thought, but I don't get as much. Here's the key thing to do. You have to get involved with a mediating instrument. Someone has to explain to you some of the key terms. The best way to do it right now is to go online and go to thomisticinstitute.org or YouTube and sign up for Aquinas 101, which is a program of 7-minute videos or 5-minute videos that will explain key Thomistic terms to you, and you will start to understand his philosophy. If you start with his philosophy and you do little tutorials, 10 minutes a day, you can get to where you really start to understand Aquinas organically, and then his writing will make sense to you. There's also some popularizers, or I would say more like clear technical presenters. So like Ed Feser, Feser, has written some very good books introducing Aquinas on the philosophical side. Fritz Bauerschmidt, he has a book, I think it used to be called Holy Teaching, and it might now just be called Introduction to the Summa Theologiae. And Bauerschmidt, which you can find on Amazon, it's a real clear introduction to Aquinas' thinking. There's a lot of good guides. So it does require investment at the beginning of time, and it can seem a little dry or surprisingly kind of opaque. But once you begin to kind of penetrate what is Aquinas talking about when he does the fundamental metaphysical, you might say ethical terms, then you start to like really, it's a world that opens up to you. And then the Summa and other great writings of Aquinas become very transparent or more transparent. Aquinas is a very clear and profound thinker. And then you start to really understand how deep his vision of reality is.
And you're in a lot of the Aquinas 101 videos, and you've given several.
And that's not why I said it, though. I didn't do it. That's not self-promotion. It's a proven tool because it's created by there's like about 40 different people who contribute, but it was designed by the Dominicans in Washington, D.C. My confrere Dominic Legg was behind it all, and he's got a team that makes these videos. And what happens is that people all over the world watch them. We've got millions of viewers now, and people get Aquinas by watching those videos. It's not the only way, but it's a very effective way. And they'll send you, if you sign up or if you work with them, they'll send you the upgrade to go to the next level, both in terms of more profound podcast lectures you can listen to and things to read, including things in Aquinas and things about Aquinas online. So it's all free, by the way. I mean, it's not about anything to do with paying. It's just free education online.
I was watching some of the ones on Aquinas and the angels this morning, actually, because I was reading through the Summa on the angels, and I was like, I think I could use someone a little smarter than me to break this down for me the first time. And it did exactly what you were saying. It had that kind of mediator to make it accessible. And the graphics are incredible in it as well. So it's cool kind of seeing the art mixed with the speaker and the content. Father, to shift. So you've mentioned Flannery O'Connor several times. A big reason I know our podcast was eager to talk to you was because you know some about Flannery O'Connor. You know a good bit about Flannery O'Connor. It's her 100th birthday coming up this year. I'm kind of curious. So you said she, I didn't know that. I was originally going to ask you when you encountered her, but that sounds like it was really one of your primary introductions to Catholicism. But for a lot of people who are new to Flannery O'Connor, she's, different. She's, her stories are not maybe what you think of necessarily when you think of Catholic stories. So how, kind of akin to the Thomas Aquinas question, what is the best way for someone to approach Flannery O'Connor? Would you say, is there a story that's good to start off? Would it be better to start with her letters?
I mean, she's not as clear as Thomas Aquinas, but that's not a problem. That wasn't necessarily why she wrote. In fact, I think sometimes she is happy to make us a little more questioning or confused about what's going on. There's a provocation. What I always tell people is to read the story called Revelation, because it's, I think, the most epitomal story about what's going on in general. What O'Connor says in one of her letters, that her stories are about how God uses the physical world to convey grace for people who don't have the sacraments. Now, we teach in Catholic theology, the sacraments, the seven sacraments, are signs and instruments of God's grace. Well, what are signs and instruments for people who don't have the seven sacraments? And so in Flannery O'Connor, it could be things like getting shot by a shotgun, getting gored by a bull, shockingly violent sometimes, these images, but that's what she does. In Revelation, that story, it's a woman who is self-justifying, not aware of her own sinfulness, getting hit in the head by a book thrown at her that is a book of sociology called Human Development. And so she undergoes a development of grace by getting hit in the head with a book of human development, which is, of course, comic and also kind of monstrous. And she almost dies from the head wound. She has a stroke. She has a vision of purgatory when she has the stroke. And what's nicely ambiguous about it is it subjective? Is it like something she wants to believe, or is it real? Now, I think obviously for O'Connor, it's real. But as a good Catholic, she knows that grace doesn't destroy nature, which Aquinas teaches. So like the whole natural hallucination or vision idea is there, but through it, there's a supernatural and grace dimension as well, where the woman's imagining something that could be almost like a dream from her head, but in it, she's really being elevated to see something. It's a nice little sort of grace and nature moment there. That story is very transparent. This is about getting saved. And it's a very Augustinian vision of the world. Human beings are sunk in almost comic absence of self-understanding and sinfulness, a mixture of tenderness, even vulnerability that's beloved, and terrible ugliness of person. I mean, her character is pretty ugly. Even her priests are pretty ugly. There's a kind of, I don't mean just physically ugly. I mean, there's a kind of like ordinary spiritual ugliness to people in her stories, but it's a non-romantic view of humanity, but it's also a comic view in which God reaches down and kind of takes what's good in human beings and addresses what's wrong with them and moves them upwardly into him. But he does it sometimes through strange and divine violence. And it's meant to shock us and wake us up. And so, you're waiting for, in Flannery O'Connor, how a physical reality or some event is going to become epiphany of God. And when you see what is easier to see is the violent event or the epiphany, it's harder to see how it's a grace. And sometimes it's not clear at all, even though clearly she's thinking of some kind of grace. And so once you understand there's a kind of, I think some people think our stories are all about kind of brutal tragedy, the ugliness of life, and the terrible ways people die, and they're tragic and nihilistic. And that's, I think, wrong. I think they're all mostly comedies about how fragile, fallen people, despite themselves and their foibles, are saved by the violent love of God. The violence outwardly is the inward sign of the intensity of divine love. And so they're comedies. They're funny stories. They're celebratory stories about how God, despite our terribleness or our weaknesses, comes in and saves us, and does it in some ways that are kind of a tragicomic. They're meant not to be fully understood, so that you have to then try to go deeper.
Her goal is still being achieved then, because so the Flannery O'Connor house, her childhood home, is, here in Savannah, and I've encountered a lot of people who are big fans of Flannery O'Connor but are not religious in any way. And so it's cool to see that so many people are getting hooked by her stories, shocked by her stories, drawn into her stories, and that they are these kind of opportunities for grace. And my introduction to Flannery O'Connor was similar to yours, where I encountered her letters first. And so it's interesting. I think Flannery O'Connor has always been very self-evidently Catholic in my mind, but it's been a good experience meeting these people who are encounter her stories first and are drawn to Catholicism through those stories.
She's one of the great Catholic artists of the 20th century, no question.
But to wrap things up, kind of something that's, remarkable, about you, thinking in the realm of just discernment. You are someone who's not only, kind of discerned a major vocation, but you've also managed to discern what to do with various talents. Music. You mentioned that you've written books, kind of just the general, intellectual atmosphere and talking. I think a lot of people get confused how they can use their talents for God's, building up the kingdom of God. Do you have any basic advice on how to discern where God might be calling, an individual to use their talents? I know that's a super general question, but you just seem to be someone who, in a really crystallized way, have utilized not only a general vocation, but your talents.
Well, I would also say in religious life, you spend some years feeling like a unemployed individual. I had 12 years of formation for various reasons. So you do also kind of have a lot of wandering and meandering where you don't know quite what you're up to. You just have to hope God uses it for some good, and maybe it's not even of that importance what happens in this life. Maybe you just belong to God for eternal life, and what we do in this life here is mostly about walking in pilgrimage toward God, and accomplishing things is kind of overrated. That being said, that's different than being checked out or uninterested or lazy. There's zealous ways to be contemplative, but this is going to sound like a super pious answer. It's going to sound like also an impossible answer, but it's actually, I think, still the right answer. When I was becoming Catholic, a Benedictine monk said to me, I was a lay person, right? He just says, the best way to kind of cooperate is just not to try to do something special yourself, but just go to the sacraments. And I took him to mean, he said, go to confession regularly. I took him to mean every week or two. I think he said every week or two. And, go to Mass most days. And I just began from the beginning, like going to Mass every day. I think I probably at the beginning went about 4 days a week. But by the second year I was Catholic, I went every day. And then I went to confession every Saturday. And that's just kind of been very important in my life, that whatever's going to happen, I'm kind of trying to stay in tune with God, and spend also some time in mental prayer. I tried to start about the second year I was in Catholic, spend 20 to 30 minutes a day in mental prayer. I haven't always succeeded, but mostly I succeeded. Then I just kind of wanted to feel the divine providence through friendships, through events. What should I be doing? And sometimes little things like baking a lasagna to take to a sick friend, but sometimes it's, bigger things like undertaking an apostolic work, or, in case of many people, it's deciding to finally get married and have kids. And then your vocation kind of gets sculpted through these life mission commitments. So I'm a kind of providentialist. I believe that what we have power over primarily is a receptivity to the sacraments, and the acceptance that we're going to have to speak the truth with charity in the public square, because people don't leave you alone. They kind of challenge you on being Catholic. You have to have the courage to say gently the truth that you believe. And I think if you do those things, it just starts to acquire a kind of efficacy. There's a fruitfulness, and it's different in different people's lives. And then, also patience, because whatever the signification of our lives in this world, they aren't reducible to what we produce or what we affect. We are definitely made for God himself. And that's part of the reason we often feel a little useless, because our aspirations are so great, but they can never be measured just by what we make or produce in this world. Although we should try to do things for God, and he will often bless them.
Well, Father, thank you so much for your time. This has been incredible. I know you mentioned Aquinas 101. Is there anything, and Hillbilly Thomists, clearly, like, and we'll put a lot of these links in the description.
Yeah.
Is there anything else people need to know if they want to kind of?
Well, I think if people are interested in anything, I mean, I've written a lot of books, but if people are interested in a book I've written, it would probably be best to give a link to my book, The Light of Christ, An Introduction to Catholicism, which is a book I wrote not about why I became Catholic, but it's a book I wrote after helping many people in Washington, D.C. over 15 years become Catholic. I wrote a kind of, presentation of the Catholic faith for kind of the young professional people I used to work with. And it's become a popular book with people to have a look at Catholicism, or to learn more about it if you're already Christian and Catholic and you want to think theologically about it.
Okay. So we'll put a link to that as well. Thank you, Father, so much for your time. And we look forward to, or we encourage everybody to go listen to the Hillbilly Thomist, to buy your book or your books and to read them. And thank you, Father.
It's been great being with you. Thank you so much.
God bless.
This has been an episode of It's Catholic, Y'all. Visit us at diosab.org or on our Diosab social media platforms for more.